Begin with a puzzle. Why did people pay Vikings not once, but repeatedly, and often on a schedule? On the surface, this looks like capitulation. In practice, it was the start of a habit. Rulers, merchants, and even raiders learned that repeatable payments could be safer than uncertain violence. That detail would shape how medieval Europe financed protection, access, and authority. Let's define what we mean by subscription-like. In modern terms, a subscription is a regular payment tied to continuing benefits. The benefit might be entertainment, storage space, or software. In the Viking Age, the benefits were more concrete. Pay on time and ships stand down. Pay on time and your cargo passes a harbor, unmolested. Pay on time and your own coast sends out a fleet when danger looms. These weren't products. They were permissions, protections, and readiness. The crucial pivot appears in Danegeld, the tribute paid to Viking forces by English kingdoms during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. At first it looked like a one-time ransom for peace. Then it happened again and again. Each repeat was both an admission and a lesson. The lesson was that raising large sums on short notice trains a government to create schedules, collectors, and expectations. In other words, ad hoc payments became the template for a cycle. Why did this repetition stick? Predictability is valuable to both sides of a negotiation. For raiders, a reliable income stream reduces the risk of costly campaigns and uncertain spoils. For rulers, a predictable outflow is easier to plan for than a surprise demand, especially when the alternative is a burned town or a shattered harvest. What mattered here was not only the money, but the calendar. When people know when payment is due, they can organize work around it. There is a technical layer to this that often gets missed. Viking commerce moved through a bullion economy. Hack silver, cut pieces of silver jewelry, coins clipped to weight, and ingots circulated by mass, not by face value. In a weight-based system, you can specify tribute in ounces or marks and deliver it without waiting on local minting. That made repeat payments feasible across cultures. Everyone could bring metal to the scales. The scales made amounts legible. This helps explain why so many Viking hoards include Islamic dirhams, Carolingian coins, and locally clipped fragments. Silver's origin mattered less than its mass. Because the unit was weight, not an authority stamp, obligations traveled well. If you're paying a levy every season, you want a measure you can reproduce. Hack silver made recurring payments portable, verifiable, and divisible into installments. The economic instrument fit the administrative habit. But recurring tribute was not only a matter of money. It was also a matter of permission. The medieval church, facing frequent Viking visitors in Christian ports and courts, settled on a practical compromise. Sources describe prime signing, the practice by which Vikings, when trading in Christian lands or entering service for pay, allowed themselves to be signed with the cross. The rite secured admission to Christian communities. It did not force a change of heart. That detail reveals the operating logic. Prime signing worked as an access gate. Submit to the form, gain the benefit. The church accepted compliance that could be performed again each time the relationship renewed. Leaders, for their part, sometimes accepted baptism more than once as a diplomatic bargain, which tells us conversion could be transactional. The continuity that mattered was not belief, but permission to operate. The rhythm sat in the rite. If this sounds familiar, it should. In modern systems, you often accept terms for access. You agree to conditions that unlock service, without anyone checking your private convictions. The important point is not the theology, but the mechanism. A standardized action, overseen by an institution, allows commerce to proceed across difference. It's another way of saying that predictable forms stabilize ongoing exchange. Notice how the same subscription logic appears at home in Scandinavia. Coastal communities organized ship levies, the ledding or lething system, by which districts had standing obligations to outfit and crew vessels when cold. The benefit was collective defense. The cost was apportioned by rotation and region. This wasn't a one-off muster. It was a repeating readiness charge. In practice, such levies worked because people knew when the duty would come due. Across the sea, in market towns under Scandinavian influence, tolls and port dues turned access into a routine. You paid for the right to dock, to weigh goods, to sell in a market. The fee supported quay maintenance, watchmen, and legal adjudicators. The moment you moved from force to rules, you needed revenue that aligned with use. Regular entries made that revenue predictable. Markets were not only places to trade. They were engines that ran on small, steady payments. By this point, a pattern emerges. Payment plus schedule equals permission and protection. The more this repeated, the more it trained administrators to count ahead. Once a ruler knows a levy will arrive each year or each season, it becomes possible to plan garrisons, fleets, and road crews. The subscription-like feature is less about modern branding than about planning. Time-structured money creates a calendar of capability. Danegeld's repetition made that calendar unavoidable. For English rulers, raising a massive sum to buy peace quickly exposed the bottlenecks in collection. You need assessors, you need receivers, and you need enforcement. The very act of paying tribute disciplined the state. It made counting subjects and their capacity a survival skill. Levying the next round took less invention, because the roots, weights, and expectations already existed. That discipline did not vanish when the external threat faded. It shifted direction. Once the machinery for recurring extraction is in place, it can be pointed inward to fund fleets, fortresses, and standing guards. Later English sources speak of heregeld, a tax to maintain paid forces in ships. Scholars debate the exact transitions and labels, but the broad move is clear. What began as crisis cash hardened into a line item. Tribute morphed into budget. There was a complementary change among the raiders. When a commander could expect payment to arrive according to bargain, the incentives tilted away from plunder and toward contract. In some cases, Viking leaders entered the service of Christian kings for pay. According to the sources, prime signing again functioned as the token of entry. The rite signaled, "We agree to your rules for the duration of our service." The reward was regular wages and lawful status. This arrangement suited both sides when it worked. Kings gained disciplined fighters and fewer raids they could not predict. Viking leaders gained legitimate income, reduced risk, and perhaps a path into landholding. The compromise did not erase old beliefs. The sources make clear that the church tolerated ceremonies whose effect was practical before it was spiritual. Even saints slid into Norse patterns of petition, another sign that function often led form in this era. If recurring tribute and rites sound abstract, think about the infrastructure they implied. To accept hack silver by weight, you need scales at ports and royal villas. To enforce a levy, you need local leaders who can assemble crews and oars. To collect a market due, you need a gate, a scribe, and a yardstick everyone trusts. Each tool ties payment to a moment, and that moment repeats. People begin to live by cycles: harvest, voyage, tax, sale. The bullion economy amplified this because it allowed fine-grained compliance. A shortfall in one district could be made up with clipped silver from another. Because the medium was divisible, the rule could be flexible without collapsing. This helps explain why so many hoards show careful cutting. People were not vandalizing coins. They were making the exact amounts their obligations required. Precision supported rhythm. There is also the question of trust. In a raid, trust is unnecessary. In a recurring payment, trust is everything. The Vikings, often portrayed as purely violent, understood reputational economics. A leader who took agreed tribute and kept his word could expect next year's payment. A leader who took payment and still raided destroyed his own revenue stream. Over time, reputations hardened into expectations. That expectation is the subscription logic at work. We should not romanticize any of this. The tribute remained coercive. People paid because the alternative was worse. But coercion alone can't run on a calendar. Something else had to develop alongside fear. Reliable channels, known agents, and shared procedures. In that sense, the tribute economy taught bureaucracy to communities that had to survive it. Once the apparatus existed, it could be repurposed. The Church's role in normalizing access is a good example. When sources note that converts' sentiments often remained heathen, they are not merely reporting inconsistency, they are recording the institutional choice to prize outward compliance. The door opened if the sign was made. That created a predictable way for pagans to enter Christian markets and courts, without disrupting doctrine every time. It was an accommodation to commerce and politics. That accommodation did more than keep the peace. It introduced the idea that a standardized, repeatable action could unlock a menu of privileges. Merchants and mercenaries learned the pattern. Present the token. Gain the right. Renew as needed. Over years, that pattern left traces in how towns managed guild entries, how ports stamped permissions, and how rulers demanded oaths for service. Access became a process, not a plea. Meanwhile, along the North Sea and Baltic, settlement deepened the cycles. Norse towns on islands and coasts needed constant provisioning and steady security. You cannot secure a trading outpost with sporadic levies. You do it with routines, watch rotations, toll calendars, and harvest-tide dues. The more these routines succeeded, the more neighbors copied them. Stability was contagious because it made profit possible. Even the geography of payment mattered. Tribute often flowed along rivers and shorelines that could be watched and counted. Weighing platforms at market crossings did double duty as tax points. That meant officials could predict not only the amount but the season. Spring sailing brought new goods. Autumn returns brought silver. The schedule wrote itself into the water and the wind. Administrators built around it. As the 11th century progressed, this subscription habit fused with evolving royal ambitions. Kings wanted standing capacities, a fleet ready to sail, a whole guard that did not disband, a network of toll gates that kept money moving. To do that, they needed recurring inputs. Some of those inputs still looked like old tribute by another name. Others were presented as duties tied to landholding or citizenship. The important point is that the rhythm remained. Look again at Danegeld through this lens. The first payment may have felt like a one-time fee to make the problem go away. Its repetition taught everyone a different lesson. Problems that return demand systems that recur. That is how a hasty ransom becomes a fiscal instrument. That is also how an improvisation becomes an institution. The calendar wins, because the calendar is a solution to uncertainty. There is a final turn worth noting, and it returns us to access rites. Prime signing and repeated baptisms show a church willing to mediate, not just preach. By recognizing the sign as sufficient for entry, clergy created a bridge across which goods, men, and money could travel. Strange mixes of belief appeared, as sources note, but beneath the complexity sat a simple mechanic, a repeatable gesture for a repeatable benefit. Ritual became a key, renewed as needed. All of this opens a larger question that will guide the rest of our story. If paying Vikings regularly started as crisis management, how did those rhythms turn into governance? The hint sits in the incentives. Predictable payments financed predictable protection. Predictable protection encouraged settlement and trade. Settlement and trade, in turn, generated more regular revenue. A loop formed, and institutions grew around it. In the next sections, we will follow that loop into concrete machinery. The naval levies that structured coastal readiness, the tolls that policed ports, and the taxes that replaced tribute with budgets. We will see how heregeld and its cousins evolved out of Danegeld's shadow, and how the silver on the scales became columns in a ledger. For now, hold on to the principle this opening has revealed. Power loves rhythm, because rhythm makes planning possible. Recurring obligations create authority by creating predictability. Vikings learned it. So did the kingdoms that paid them. What began as an accommodation in the face of ships on the horizon ended as a habit built into the year. And that habit, once learned, was very hard to unlearn. We are going to trace the mechanics of that habit next, the practical steps that made recurring payments normal, and the quiet moment when payment for peace became revenue for rule. Well, the pattern began as crisis management. A Viking fleet appeared, a city panicked, and a ruler offered silver to make the danger go away. The payment had a name, Danegeld, and once the money moved, the ships pulled back. What mattered here was not just the payoff, but the habit it trained. If money solved the problem once, it could solve it again. We see that clearly in England at the turn of the 11th century. After a major attack, a payment of £16,000 of silver secured a promise to stop further raids. That number mattered because it was public and memorable, a benchmark for the next bargain. If payment ended one crisis, a slightly larger sum might end the next. The almost incredible total of more than £150,000 of silver, moved in a little over 2 decades. That detail reveals a deeper shift from occasional tribute to a cycle people could anticipate. Why did repetition take hold so quickly? Raiding was expensive and risky. Ships had to be maintained, crews fed, and wind and weather could erase the best plan. A reliable payout reduced uncertainty and spread risk across a region's taxpayers instead. On the other side, a king who could not catch fast-moving fleets still controlled land and law. He could lift money faster than he could raise effective defense. In practice, the cost-benefit math for both sides favored silver over unpredictable bloodshed. To make repetition possible, the rulers needed a system that could produce money on command. Here the land-based assessment known as the geld mattered. It treated land in hides, a counting unit that allowed administrators to assign shares of a national sum to local places. This helped because it turned a vague demand into a calculable amount per shire and hundred. People did not have to guess. They were told, in effect, your area owes this many pounds, and the rest was collection and compliance. England already ran a sophisticated coinage in this period, issuing standardized silver pennies through royal mints. That feature shortened the distance between a decree at court and a chest of silver at a meeting place. Coins could be counted, but more often they were weighed in bulk to speed exchanges. Standard weights and scales made the silver legible across boundaries. This is why hack silver and coin could dance in the same system. Weight decided value, and the tools for weighing were cheap, portable, and trusted. Think of the logistics at ground level. Shire reeves called men to gather, silver was brought in bags, and local officials set out balances on trestles. Weight stones and beam scales settled arguments. The process looked like accounting because it was. It also felt predictable because everyone knew when to appear and what would happen there. Setting collection at seasonal points, after harvest, or alongside other court days, reduced friction by attaching the demand to an existing calendar. The important point is not the exact date, but the rhythm. Once people could expect the demand, they planned for it. The schedule created its own incentives. A fleet would anchor within sight, but beyond reach. waiting for the agreed transfer. That visible presence was more than intimidation. It was timing. If payment was late, the next move was clear. If it arrived on time, the agreement renewed by custom. In other words, the Vikings provided a recurring service, absence of violence, tied to a recurring payment that justified the service. The cycle reinforced itself through the coordination of clocks and expectations. Compliance needed teeth. Hostages, sworn oaths, and public ceremonies anchored the bargain in social rules. A hostage system worked like collateral, a living bond that discouraged betrayal. Oaths bound elite reputations to outcomes, and the presence of armed men and ships at the edge of the horizon added what we might call late fee enforcement. Non-payment triggered direct penalties. That mechanism is why the analogy to auto-renew works in spirit. The cycle continued unless someone acted to cancel it, and cancellation carried sharp costs. There were also carrots. A group that took silver often accepted market rules for trade, and even stepped into royal service for pay. One compromise was known as prime signing, where Vikings allowed themselves to be marked with the cross to access Christian communities as traders or mercenaries. That ritual served as an access credential. It lowered transaction costs by signaling who could be admitted and on what terms. In practice, it was part of the same subscription logic. Pay and comply, and you stay inside a protected market. In Francia, the pattern played out through repeated truces and targeted payments. A king under pressure might pay a fixed sum to lift a siege or redirect a fleet upriver. These were not random gifts. They were structured negotiations that bundled territory, safe passage, and sometimes market privileges into renewed peace. When talks succeeded, the same leaders would return later to renegotiate under similar frames. This helps explain why Viking groups learned the language of charters and oaths. Paperwork and ritual turned uncertain threats into scheduled obligations. The subscription analogy becomes clearer when we unpack the terms. The value proposition was simple: no raids and safer roads. The billing cycle appeared as seasonal or annual geld, sized by land assessment and paid at known assemblies. The escalation clause was embedded in reality. Failure to pay invited immediate penalties in the form of targeted violence. And retention tactics showed up as sweetened offers, expanded trade zones, service contracts, or recognition of local autonomy, meant to keep both sides engaging instead of gambling on a breakdown. But there was a deeper technology behind all of this, a working information system. How did rulers know what each region could bear? Hitage lists, local juries, and shire officials created shared numbers that could be checked and argued but not ignored. The silver itself, counted and weighed, left trails in hoards and in mint, output that archaeologists still read today. We know the pulse of these payments not just from chronicles but from the distribution of coins and hack silver buried and lost, and from the poems that praised kings who poured silver to buy great outcomes. Repetition turned skill into structure. By the early 11th century, the English crown under King Cnut moved from paying enemies to paying itself. The tax known as heregeld, literally army payment, was levied annually to support a standing fleet and professional housecarls. This was not simply tribute renamed. It was tribute domesticated. Money once raised as an emergency surrender was now raised as a budget line to fund a service, coastal security, and royal force on call. The important point is not changing names, but changing ownership of the subscription. Heregeld drew on the same assessment mechanics as the older geld. But because the system already assigned obligations by hide, the state could announce a rate and push the sum down the ladder into shires and hundreds. Officials understood how to gather it because they had done so repeatedly under duress. The difference was where the silver sailed. Instead of chests loaded onto enemy ships, coin flowed into royal hands to maintain crews, repair ships, and pay stipends. The cycle, demand, collection, disbursement, remained. The destination and purpose shifted. A standing fleet needs constant attention. Timber rots, ropes wear, and men must be paid regardless of whether the wind blows. That is why a permanent levy mattered. It matched the continuous nature of the service with a continuous income stream. Sporadic payments cannot keep ships seaworthy. Scheduled revenue can. In effect, the Crown adopted the very logic that had worked against it. Predictability underwrote capability. This move created a new kind of credibility. A perennially funded force changed the negotiation calculus with Viking fleets. Instead of buying time with silver, the king could buy time with a patrol. That shift did not end raiding overnight, but it altered risk on both sides. A raider now faced a higher baseline chance of interception. Meanwhile, towns and markets paid into a system where the benefits were visible in peacetime. That connection, tax to protection, began to feel like a social contract rather than a coerced ransom. It also knitted finance into administration. Shire reeves and royal agents managed not just occasional levies, but regular budgeting. They learned to calendar income and plan disbursement. That is how routines become durable. The act of planning around a known future payment locks institutions into cycle thinking. It encourages lists, roles, and standard procedures. And it makes local elites stakeholders in the system's continuity, since their reputations rise or fall with smooth collection. One might ask why Viking groups accepted this arrangement. The answer is that stability had value for them too. If part of a fleet entered the service of a king as hired muscle, they gained legal cover and steady pay. Others shifted into trade, using prime signing and host arrangements to integrate with Christian polities. A clear schedule of royal levies and dues meant predictable environments to sell and winter. This helps explain a wider arc. Raiders became landlords, landlords became lords, and recurring payments blurred into recognized rights. The challenge, however, was dependency. For decades, English rulers had normalized external tribute. Every renewal made it harder to return to a purely defensive posture. That dependency triggered desperate responses. One notorious decree attempted a brutal purge of Danes within the realm. It failed to break the cycle and likely invited harsher retaliation. The deeper lesson is administrative. Once a payment habit forms, you need a better system to replace it, not just an act of anger. Heregeld was that replacement. Imperfect, costly, but internally directed. Francia handled the dependency by combining payments with settlement and vassalage. Truces turned into conditional grants. Leaders who had taken silver to go away took oaths to stay, defend a border, and protect trade along a river. That blended fiscal routine with political order. It changed the promise from negative, "we will not raid," to positive, "we will secure." The revenue logic persisted, though now couched in dues, tolls, and services rendered as fief obligations. The subscription became contract law. Underneath, the tools stayed simple. Scales, weights, coin dies, wooden chests. Their power lay in repetition and in the authority to convene people at the same time and place, season after season. A sound could announce a court day. A measuring stick could anchor an argument. A rough beam and two pans could adjudicate claims. These humble instruments did more than count silver. They synchronized action across an unruly landscape. English chroniclers framed repeated Danegeld as humiliation. Yet the numbers also reveal experimentation under stress. The Crown learned what its economy could lift, and how quickly. It mapped who complied and who delayed, building a mental ledger of trustworthy districts. That information returned as pressure on dissenters in later levies. In practice, every cycle was also a census of capacity. That is why the later royal record-keeping would seem so mature. It had been trained by years of scheduled extraction. We should pause on the question of predictability. In finance, predictability lowers the cost of capital. In governance, it lowers the cost of force. A state that can call revenue on schedule need not win every skirmish. It only needs to fund enough deterrence to make the worst threats inefficient. That was the strategic move behind heregeld and the continuation of geld after the immediate crises. Scheduled money bought room for strategy. Of course, predictable payments can also invite complacency. If the crown treated heregeld as a guaranteed stream, it might fail to justify or reform the service it funded. That risk mirrored a modern subscription fatigue problem. Yet, unlike software, the output here was tangible. Ships in harbors, soldiers at halls, and patrols on rivers. Visible presence mattered. It signaled that the levy purchased a real service, not a wish. Viewed from the Viking perspective, recurring tribute changed tactics. Instead of always threatening to burn, leaders could threaten to leave protection undone. That difference has weight. It implies a territory they cared to influence and routes they wanted to keep open for their own benefit. It points toward the next transformation, where fleets pivot from raiding to policing trade for a fee. The roots of that shift lie in the habits built by Danegeld and fixed by heregeld. Enforcement remained layered. Oaths gave shape to expectations. Hostages underwrote compliance in fragile moments. And visible force kept the system honest. Yet the more the cycle repeated, the more compliance came from routine rather than fear. People paid because the demand felt normal, and because neighbors paid as well. Social proof works in tax systems. It makes default a minority act, costly and conspicuous. There is another piece here. The way administration bundled payments with identity. To be a good town, a good shire, a good lord was to meet the levy on time. That reputational economy lubricated the gears. Officials who delivered smoothly gained favor, and sometimes privilege. Privilege returned as favorable assessments next time. These reciprocities are the quiet mechanics that turn raw coercion into a working fiscal state. Our sources catch this in fragments. Chronicles list sums with outrage or relief. Skaldic verses praise kings who gave silver, hinting at the flows that precede generosity. Archaeology fills gaps with coin hoards, hack silver fragments, and scales buried with traders. Each line of evidence supports the same picture, a world learning to think in cycles of payment, to coordinate large groups around scheduled obligations, and to translate fear into finance. The analogy to modern subscriptions is not a gimmick. It is a way to notice structure. Predictable billing, durable value promise, penalties for lapse, and retention through added benefits. These patterns all appear. They explain why crisis tribute became a repeatable routine. They also explain the incentive to internalize the cycle. If you are going to pay regularly, better to pay your own fleet and your own guards. The lingering tension, though, is dependency on yesterday's bargain. Pay too long, and you fund the very actors that constrain you. Shift too abruptly, and you invite catastrophic retaliation. The narrow path ran through administration. Stabilize payments at home. Build credible enforcement of your own, and negotiate external obligations into recognized rights. That is why, across England and Francia, we watch tribute blend into taxation, and raiders turn into lords of markets and rivers. By the time the Viking Age passed its peak, the habit of repeating payments had hardened. It taught kings how to budget in cycles, taught traders to plan across seasons, and taught ordinary communities that obligations arrive on calendars. Those calendars made possible the next moves: naval levies scheduled in peacetime, market dues pinned to fares, and tolls scaled to boats and cargo lists. In the next step of this story, the payments move further from the quays of negotiation and into the dry schedules of governance. The subscription idea leaves the shoreline and enters the archive. Naval levies, and market access do not just echo Danegeld. They reroute it into a system that could outlive the fleets that first forced it into being. To see the subscription logic from the inside, we have to go home with the Vikings. Not to the raids, but to the coastal districts that built the ships and fed the crews on a schedule. Their name for the naval levy was Leganger, the dung in parts of Sweden, and it functioned like dues for collective defense. The important point is that it ran on a calendar. Households planned for it, local assemblies enforced it, and leaders counted on it as a resource that returned each season. Each coastline was divided into ship districts, known in Norway as Skipsriga, and in parts of Sweden as Skepslag. A district's job was simple to state and hard to do: outfit and crew a warship when called. That meant timber, nails, tar, rope, sails, and a full bench of rowers with weapons and food. This structure solved a coordination problem. Instead of a king scrambling to find a fleet when danger appeared, the country prearranged who would supply which piece of a moving system. The levy did not run year-round. It had a rhythm that mostly followed the sailing season, when seas were open and harvests had not yet locked people to their fields. That seasonal cadence mattered. It told farmers when to set aside grain and dried fish for weeks at sea, and it told smiths when demand for iron fittings would spike. In other words, the calendar itself functioned as a contract, shaping the economy around predictable peaks of obligation. Law codes across Scandinavia eventually put this into writing. They listed equipment requirements and provisioning standards in pragmatic terms, because the levy had to work in practice, not just on parchment. A man might be expected to bring shield and spear, an axe or sword, and a bow with a set number of arrows, along with food for a fixed window of time. The numbers varied by region and period, but the logic held. Specify the package, then you can audit it at muster. That detail reveals how standardization made obligation measurable. Ship districts used the bench as a unit of contribution. Each bench paired 2 oars, and each pair implied a small cluster of farms responsible for the men and the gear. In practice, that created a roster. A district knew which benches were tied to which families, and the families planned their labor around likely call-ups. The next step depended on that earlier choice. By binding households to specific seats, the levy turned abstract duty into visible tasks. Musters had the feel of renewal days. The boats were inspected, crews counted, weapons checked, and provisions weighed or at least measured. Taxation by inspection is a rough phrase, but it captures the point. This was a subscription where the payment often came as service and stuff, verified in public before the ship cast off. Public muster reduced shirking. It also let communities see who was carrying weight and who was asking for exceptions. Exceptions happened, and they taught administrators a lesson. When a man could not serve, or when distance made it inefficient, some regions allowed commutation, paying money instead of showing up. Initially, this solved practical problems. Ships needed cash for repairs and sudden purchases. Over time, it created a standing stream. Regular money in place of occasional labor is the hinge that turns a military duty into a fiscal instrument. That helps explain why later medieval records talk about levy money by name. The levy also needed a forum to set expectations and settle disputes. That is where thing assemblies came in, those periodic meetings where free men debated and decided law. Obligations were articulated there, not only because that was the custom, but because predictability made the economy intelligible. If you knew the expected muster month and the fines for failing to appear, you could budget fodder, grain, and time. It made the extraordinary ordinary enough to live with. Discipline worked through a mix of social pressure and posted penalties. If a bench was short a man, the fine might be spread across the contributing farms, a gentle but real incentive to solve the shortage locally. If a ship failed to appear, the district faced larger penalties. In practice, that distributed enforcement encouraged pooling resources. People formed quiet insurance networks. I take your turn this year, you cover me next, so the ship would meet its quota without crippling any one household. All of this sits inside a social world that saw itself as aristocratic, but oddly egalitarian within its fighting class. When asked who was their lord, one source has Rollo's men answer, "We have no lord, we are all equal." That line sounds like bravado, but it had a function. It justified a culture where status gave access to decision-making and shares of spoils. But no man within the warband could claim to stand above the code. The levy, in that light, was a way to make equality productive by distributing obligation. The same sources remind us that equality at the top did not mean democracy throughout society. The aristocracy was military first, landowning second, and their rights were hedged with duties that neighbors could see. Yet beneath that circle stood commoners who bore much of the levy's weight. That tension mattered. It shaped how rules were written at the thing and how fines were structured. The important point is not just who paid, but who decided the terms and who could adjust them. Even the word king needs context here. Annals list multiple kings at once, a sign that the title traveled more freely than later monarchies would allow. Leadership existed, and it was organized, but it rarely crushed the collective. In practice, levy calls depended as much on local buy-in as on royal command. That detail reveals a system closer to a federation of commitments than a pure top-down order, which is exactly why reliable calendars and clear quotas mattered. If we want a window into the membership logic of a warrior community, the laws of the Jomsborg settlement offer a famous, if exceptional, example. The reserved rule set outlines who can join, how shares are handled, and what penalties follow for breaking discipline. Historians warn us not to project Jomsborg's strictness everywhere, but the existence of a code is itself revealing. It shows that even elite warriors thought in terms of terms and conditions, with scheduled duties and predictable sanctions. Jomsborg's rules read today like a charter, not a saga. Not a saga. They set expectations before action, because certainty is a weapon of its own. Lay out the calendar, and you create a machine that can run without constant personal negotiation. That helps explain why levy systems were not only military tools, but also learning environments. They trained communities to accept recurring obligation as the price of collective benefits, defense, status, and a seat at the table where rules were made. Meanwhile, the actual lives of leaders looked more domestic than our raid-heavy picture suggests. One source describes a chieftain as an active country gentleman, working his land and taking pleasure in the chase, falcon on wrist. That detail matters because it shows where obligations lived. Most of the year, authority looked like estate management, not constant warfare. The levy fit into that routine world. It asked for time-boxed effort and planned provision, then let people return to farming, hunting, and local stewardship. Season after season, the levy created rituals of readiness. Boat sheds were checked after winter storms. Sails were pulled from storage to be aired and mended, or leathers were rewrapped. These are humble details, but they explain why a schedule matters more than a slogan. Predictable maintenance prevents failure in the moment of need. In effect, the levy converted coastal economies into maritime maintenance hubs on a cycle that both leaders and households could anticipate. Over time, as kingdoms consolidated, levy obligations showed up in writing as money names. In some regions, people spoke of leading spending, levy money paid into chests instead of rowing into battle. That was not a betrayal of the old duty. It was an adaptation to scale. As fleets professionalized and long-distance operations grew, Cash smoothed the gaps that service could not fill. The next step depended on that earlier commutation. Steady revenue gave rulers leverage to plan beyond the next season. The membership analogy becomes clearer when you listen to what levy participants received in return. Beyond defense, participation conveyed standing. A man who met his bench duty could claim a voice at the assembly and a right to carry arms in public spaces that mattered. He had paid his dues, literally or in service, and he could claim the benefits. That logic will sound familiar to anyone who has ever joined a co-op or a guild. Payment secures goods, but it also secures belonging. Of course, tiers existed. An elite warrior might serve as prowman and sit near the leader at feasts, a privilege bundle that signaled both risk and reward. The common farmer on a middle bench saw less of the spoils and more of the work. Yet the levy's schedule softened the resentment that could follow. Everyone knew when the ask would come and when it would end. Predictability is a social technology. It turns coercion into custom by allowing people to plan around a burden. The levy rested on both law and oath. As Christianity spread through the north, people swore oaths on relics as well as at sacred sites from older traditions. The law's force did not come from a single theology. It came from a community's ability to say, "We all agreed on this day to this requirement." That blend of sacred gesture and legal notice made enforcement feel legitimate, even to those who might have preferred to skip a season. Administrators learned to track compliance with modest tools. A lawman might keep a roster by bench and name, updated at each muster. Fines could be recorded as a tally or a noted transfer of silver at the next assembly. The instruments were simple, but the effect was modern. The levy created data. With the next call, failure was visible. That is how recurring obligations teach bureaucracy, even when no one uses that word. Geography shaped the levy's face. Norway's broken coastline, cut by fjords, required many small ship districts and rapid beacon systems to mobilize nearby crews. Denmark's flatter shores favored larger districts with easier musters on big inlets. Sweden's Ledung relied on inland waters and river routes in some regions, producing ship districts that looked inland as much as out. The way people paid was tuned to the water they had to defend, but the cadence held. As the levy matured, tensions sharpened between local autonomy and central ambition. Kings wanted ships when they wanted them, and for longer. Farmers wanted obligations that started and ended on agreed dates. The compromise was often to let money cover extensions. And if a campaign ran past the window, extra pay would flow to crews or extra fines to those who left. That adjustment preserved the sense of a subscription with defined terms, even as rulers stretched its limits. Enforcement also had a social face. Refusal could bring shame as much as financial loss. People noticed who dodged duty, just as they noticed who stepped forward. Honor cultures make peer judgment into soft power. In practical terms, that meant a district would police itself to avoid collective penalties. This helps explain why levy noncompliance remained the exception in many periods. The system turned neighbors into enforcers by tying their fates to one ship. Look closely at the economics, and the levy reads like risk pooling. A single farm could not afford to build or crew a warship, just as a single village could not insure itself against every raid. The skip Riga gathered those capacities and spread the cost across benches and years. In other words, the levy was insurance-like. Before insurance, it replaced sharp, unpredictable losses with scheduled smaller ones, and it delivered a service, coastal security, that no house could buy alone. Beyond defense, the levy supported trade by guaranteeing convoy or patrols during the busy months. That benefit mattered in cash terms. A market that trusts its sea lanes can price goods lower and move more volume. So even those who did not step on deck saw a return. The market's ability to assume safe passage was, in part, a dividend from everyone's dues. That detail would shape later royal arguments for keeping levy money flowing, even when threats seemed distant. The Jomsborg example returns here as a caution and a clue. It cautions us not to imagine perfect uniformity. Different settlements wrote different terms. But it also supplies the clue that structure preceded story. A warrior community did not rely on charisma alone. It posted rules, set schedules, and specified penalties. Seen from that angle, the levy and the warband code share a family resemblance. Both are membership systems designed to make cooperation reliable. As literacy spread and royal chanceries grew, levy obligations left more paper or parchment behind. Clerks could total levy money in annual accounts and list which districts were in arrears. That new visibility changed politics. Rulers could argue from numbers, not only from fear. Predictable revenue became a claim in its own right, a justification for building docks, standardizing coins, and keeping permanent crews on payroll. The administrative tail began to wag the military dog. Regional variation preserved the core logic while producing different labels. In Denmark, versions of the letting sat alongside other royal rights, forming a web of dues that underwrote fleets, used for both defense and assertion. In Norway, the skip-riga system anchored coastal mobilization, supported by boathouses and beacon hills that kept calls local and fast. In Sweden, ship districts under the ledung fed into larger provincial frameworks. The names change, but the pattern, the recurring ask for a packaged contribution, holds. Who then paid and who decided? Elites dominated the assemblies where rules were written, and their voice weighed more. But their reputation rested on visible performance. A leader who failed to appear with his prow crew, or who tried to shirk fines, damaged his standing in a culture that measured status by deed. This reciprocal exposure made the levy surprisingly sticky. It tied the high and the humble to the same calendar, even if their shares were unequal. Commutation into money widened the gap. Those with cash could buy time. Those without had to row. Administrators noticed and sometimes tiered the rates, or let collective funds pay for a substitute. Those adjustments show a system trying to keep fairness within reach without losing efficiency. The important point is not that it always succeeded, but that the calendar focused the argument. People fought over terms they could see and dates they could circle. By the close of the Viking period, levy logic was embedded enough to survive changes in faith and fashion. Baptism did not cancel bench duty. Church rites might bless the muster, but they did not replace it. Leaders could hunt and hawk, and still be judged by how smoothly their ship district turned out in June. That continuity tells us something. Recurring obligations become culture when they help ordinary routines carry exceptional risk. If you stand back, the home front picture looks less like episodic warfare and more like managed membership. Dues flowed as service or money. Benefits came as protection, status, and access to decision-making. Renewals were marked by musters, inspections, and the reassessment of fines and exemptions. Even penalties had a cadence. All of that built habits, checking kit, storing provisions, updating rosters, that trained communities to think in cycles. This helps explain why, when later monarchs wanted stable fleets without calling every bench, they had a template ready. You could change the mix, less rowing, more coin, but keep the schedule. You could also argue that markets and harbors deserved patrols because the community had paid. In that shift, a levy for emergencies became a budget line for ordinary governance. And once a payment becomes ordinary, it tends to stay. The next step in our story takes that logic from ships to shorefronts. Once levy calendars taught people to pay for defense on schedule, tolls and market dues could borrow the same rhythm for access and trade. The subscription mindset, predictable cycles, packaged benefits, and posted terms had moved in. What mattered now was how rulers and merchants would use it, and how far predictability could go before it turned into complacency. When the fleets stood down and the war chests cooled, another rhythm took over. Access became the service, and the gate was the harbor. To use it, you paid on a schedule that matched your sailing life. Ports and markets worked like gated platforms. The entry requirement was not loyalty or lineage, but a predictable package of tolls and landing dues. That predictability mattered because it converted the uncertainty of travel into a rule you could plan around. A routine formed that almost any merchant could recite. Arrive at the road or river gate, declare your cargo, present your measures to be checked, and pay the set dues. In exchange, you received legal protection, an assigned stall or mooring, and a known path to justice if anything went wrong. The logic was simple but powerful. The peace of the market, often guaranteed in a ruler's name, was conditional on payment and compliance. That detail reveals how rulers sold not just space, but a strip of temporary sovereignty wrapped around you and your goods. Seasons pushed this routine into a calendar. Spring sailings, summer fairs, autumn returns, all carried their own dues and checkpoints. This helps explain why payments began to feel like subscriptions. They repeated, they aligned with user behavior, and they bought continuity. Rates were written down, sometimes in municipal customs and sometimes in royal edicts. That shift mattered more than any single fee. Once written, the same dues could be collected year after year, which made revenue forecastable and enforcement less arbitrary. Tiers appeared. Locals paid one rate, foreign merchants another, and guild members sometimes secured a discount or exemption through their collective dues. What? The important point is not just price discrimination, but the way tiers fixed expectations about privilege and service level. Across the Irish Sea, Norse settlements showed what this looked like when raiders turned harbor keepers. In Ireland, Vikings clustered in coastal towns and nearby districts, channeling energy into shipping and trade more than inland farming. That urban pivot created a natural incentive to turn access into a product that could be sold repeatedly. Dublin's naval power reached along the coast from Waterford to Dundalk, and fleets crowded the Irish Channel. We know too that Irish trade grew, with links to France and Spain leaving their mark in language and practice. The implication is clear. Regular tolls and port customs were not distractions from war, but tools that made maritime power pay. York in the English Danelaw, often called Jorvik, mirrored this pattern on the North Sea side. A minted coinage, a dense market quarter, and a riverine approach demanded controlled entries and routine fees. This helps explain why both commerce and community life concentrated under written customs that told people exactly what to expect at the gate. Weighing and measuring were not ceremonial flourishes. Officials compared merchants' scales to a standard, and weights might be stamped or rejected. In practice, that single check lowered transaction costs across the market day by clarifying which disputes would even be heard. Gatekeepers, port reeves, weighers, and market bailiffs made the rules visible. Their stations were the living interface of the system, where payment flipped access from off to on. That detail tells us something important about medieval administration. It advanced through repeatable contact points rather than abstract policy. Then came a credential that seemed spiritual, but worked like an access badge. Vikings visiting Christian communities often allowed themselves to be signed with the cross, a practice known as prime signing. It unlocked admission to Christian markets and service, while leaving their private beliefs largely untouched. The church accepted the arrangement. Leaders accepted baptism, even more than once, often as part of a diplomatic bargain that opened doors, rather than remade convictions. What mattered here was interoperability, a shared ritual that folded outsiders into the legal and social fabric where trade happened. Prime signing was compliance, in a soft wrapper. It said in effect you are temporarily inside the community's peace, subject to its rights and rules. In practice, this ritual offered what a toll could not: a portable credential that followed the person across different gates. Payment and ritual worked together as a bundle. One addressed the estate's or borough's purse, the other the community's boundaries. That pairing made access durable because it answered both the fiscal and cultural barriers to entry. Imagine a Norse crew seeking to sell cargo in a Christian port. The gatekeepers needed more than silver. They needed a signal that these men were safe to admit, safe to protect, and safe to serve. Crime signing lowered that social risk, which is why it persisted even when convictions remained mixed. Rulers read the advantage quickly. If a ritual could standardize admission, then officials could update their ledgers with who owed what, when, and under which protection. That process nudged trade into a counted world without forcing full conversion or permanent allegiance. Once common rates and shared rights existed, rate cards could circulate between towns. Merchants learned the price of using Dublin's quays, York's market bridges, or a fare at a named feast. This helped explain why trust grew. It is easier to accept a fee when it matches a known schedule rather than a whim at the gate. Fares added another layer of regularity. They were periodic by design, often anchored to saints' days or harvest windows, and they reset the cycle of dues. A predictable fare is a seasonal subscription, with renewal dates printed into the calendar and benefits clustered around the event. Landing dues were not abstract taxes. They paid for upkeep. Quays needed repairs, moorings needed management, and harbor approaches needed markers and patrols. The important point is that the fee financed the platform itself, which justified repeating it with each arrival. Once fees maintained the platform, a portion of municipal finance floated on access payments. Boroughs defended their rights in charters, sometimes listing tolls, markets, and related privileges in almost formulaic language. This codification pushed ad hoc exactions into standing policy. In the Danelaw, borough customs recognized the need to keep toll collectors honest because predictable dues were the product. Officials could be challenged at assemblies, and appeals had processes, even if outcomes varied. That detail reveals a simple truth. If access is a service, customer complaints become part of governance. Reciprocity anchored the exchange. Pay the dues and the ruler's peace applied to your person, your stall, and your goods. Without payment, you stood outside that shelter, and violence or confiscation could be treated as private misfortune rather than public breach. The model even shaped how governments handled collection. Instead of collecting every coin themselves, rulers sometimes granted or leased the right to take tolls to trusted partners. That arrangement, often called toll farming later, functioned like a reseller agreement for access rights. Outsourcing collection made sense because it turned uncertain daily intake into a known annual sum. The farmer took the risk and earned the margin, while the ruler booked predictable revenue. This helps explain why access fees slipped so easily in sophisticated finance before written bureaucracies were mature. Writtenness followed the money. Charters, port customs, and even notched records existed to bind memory to a schedule. What mattered most was not the instrument, but the fact of recording the obligation with a date, a rate, and a right of use. As more merchants paid, the platform improved because revenue funded smoother entry and stricter peace. That positive feedback loop gave access subscriptions a network effect. The more who bought in, the more valuable the gate became. It was a quiet but potent way to turn raiders into guardians of shared order. Viking leaders leaned into that guardianship. A fleet that once extracted tribute now justified its keep by patrolling approaches, deterring pirates, and enforcing the dues that funded its watch. In other words, the subscription redirected violence toward maintaining the platform that sold access. Irish towns show this movement clearly. The Norse presence gave the impetus to town life and drove the expansion, perhaps even the birth, of Irish trade. Those towns needed rules to thrive. which is why their growth traveled with bureaucratic routines around tolls and harbor rights. The language shift in Gaelic, with shipping terms borrowed from Norse, captures how technical habit reshapes culture. A borrowed word often reflects a borrowed practice and its embedded rules. This helps explain the endurance of access systems, even when political control shifted. Markets carried their own courts, often held on stools or benches inside the trading space. Minor disputes over measures or payments were settled on the spot with known fines and procedures. That proximity kept enforcement low cost, which made repeat payments feel like a fair exchange rather than a shakedown. Cross-border traders sometimes carried letters of conduct or used known intermediaries to smooth entry. Those instruments functioned like a higher-tier plan that included extra protections and sometimes rate reductions. The point was to stabilize expectations when moving across multiple jurisdictions. All of this generated a new kind of ruler's confidence. Predictable access money allowed ships, quays, and guards to be scheduled and paid. Strategy could stretch beyond the next raid to the next season, then to the next decade. At the midpoint, the change turns bureaucratic. Rates move from bargaining to writing. Rituals move from conversion to credential. Port guards shift from ad hoc muscle to salaried staff. The levy logic we met at sea now runs ashore as a recurring, auditable, access-first finance. We should be careful not to romanticize the order. Disputes over rates, favoritism toward locals, and smuggling across creeks were constant. But even evasion reveals how the system worked, because people shaped their behavior around predictable checkpoints. Consistency also widened participation. A farmer's son could take a load of wool to market, knowing what he would owe and what peace would cover him. Predictability lowered the barrier to entry, which made the pool of payers deeper and steadier. The combination of dues and prime signing did more than integrate Vikings into Christian polities. It taught both sides how to turn cultural boundaries into procedural gates. Once a boundary is operationalized that way, it can scale because it is repeatable. Leaders, especially those straddling multiple realms, learn to use conversion ceremonies as onboarding. Baptism could open direct access to a king's service for pay, or enable trade relations with Christian towns. The profession might be shallow, but the administrative link it forged was deep. Even compromises like Helgi the Lean, Christian in name but calling on Thor in need, illustrate the point. Belief could be mixed because the system asked for behavior first. Show the sign, pay the dues, obey the peace. What you felt at sea was your own affair. Access was not only about harbors. Bridges, river locks, and even road gates collected tolls that purchased passage and protection. The same subscription logic applied because the service was continuity across defended and maintained corridors. The practice traveled along a Dublin-York, Danelaw axis, and far beyond. Where Norse influence touched, you often find market rights thickening and dues acquiring calendars. This is not coincidence. It is convergence around what worked in a world of waterborne trade. For rulers, the clarity of written dues had a final advantage. It was easier to grant privileges intentionally, like free toll to a monastery or a guild, because the baseline terms were known. That made favors legible and rewards targeted, which is a hallmark of maturing administration. Guilds and fraternities took the hint. By pooling dues, they bargained collectively for better terms and steadier protection. The group itself became a subscription within the larger access subscription, multiplying predictability for its members. To keep the machine credible, visible reinvestment mattered. New quays, repaired bridges, and patrols signaled that dues brought real benefits. That detail reveals a timeless truth about recurring payments. Renewal lives or dies on the perceived value of the service. Even the rhythm of coinage tied into this world. Regular minting in certain towns ensured that market dues could be paid in predictable currency, rather than awkward barter. That choice lowered friction at the gate and kept lines moving. Small gains that add up when repeated. Administrators learned to align their calendars with sailors' calendars. Inspectors appeared at the start of seasons. Fairs were spaced to attract runs, and winter dues might ease to coax a trickle of traffic. The aim was steady usage, not maximized extraction on any single day. Because of that alignment, risk diversified. A bad voyage did not mean a lost year if the fair waited 2 months ahead. This helps explain why maritime regions under Norse influence developed a thicker layer of small traders. The platform absorbed some shocks. We can also see how the system created new edge cases. What counted as foreign, who deserved the lower local rate, and where a guild's authority ended were constant negotiations. The point is that subscriptions clarified most things, but also drew lines that people wanted to cross. At bottom, access became a service because it allowed rulers and traders to share a language of predictable exchange. Harbor peace, ritual compliance, and written dues performed that language in public. Every reenactment of the routine made it easier to accept again. The subscription analogy is not only a metaphor. We see account verification in prime signing, tiers in local versus foreign tolls, and service continuity in the peace of the mark. We also see what happens when payment lapses, access ends, and protection withdraws. By the later Viking Age, the pattern looked settled. Crisis tribute at sea had become scheduled defense money, and on shore, the gates worked the same logic with different inputs. That convergence prepared medieval Europe for broader taxation that could ride on the same rails. Which brings the question forward. Once access was routinized and receipts became legible, how far could rulers push the model into general revenue, beyond gates and into households? The next step would test the balance between predictability and power in an even more intimate arena. By the early 11th century, something curious had happened. Payments born in panic no longer ended when the warships slipped over the horizon. Rulers kept the schedules, even when the immediate Viking threat eased. Whoa! What mattered here was the discovery that predictable revenue is useful in its own right, because it lets a kingdom plan. Danegeld began as emergency tribute to buy off raiders who held the world at ransom for generations. In practice, that ransom taught administration, a habit it did not forget. Assessors learned to rate districts, sheriffs learned to gather sums, and coin flowed on calendars rather than only on coronations or crises. The habit persisted because the process itself solved problems of organization and trust. The idea was simple enough. Divide land into taxable units, then charge those units a share at regular intervals. England used the hide as an assessment yardstick, a notional measure of productive land rather than a fixed acreage. This helped officials translate local wealth into comparable obligations. It also created a ledger logic where obligations could be tallied, negotiated, or delayed, but always measured. Out of that logic came something new, heregeld under King Canute. Danegeld had paid Vikings to go away. Heregeld paid a standing force to stay. It funded housecarls, the king's professional bodyguard, and maintained a defending fleet as an ongoing service rather than a one-off burst. In other words, protection became a subscription product of the state. This worked because a steady navy and professional guards reduced the spikes of danger that drained treasuries and patience. Predictable money smoothed unpredictable violence. When the royal court knew roughly what would arrive each year, it could time refits, buy timber in winter, and hire specialists before a campaign. Calendars replaced panicked rummaging for silver. Administration met the moment. The shire reeve, the sheriff, stood at the hinge between local obligation and royal account. He summoned hundreds in townships, collected hide shares, and rendered tallies to the center. Audits shifted from seeing men muster on a beach to seeing figures line up on boards. The subscription logic of the naval levy moved from oars and benches into ink and counters. Coinage made this possible, and minting reforms made it credible. Late Anglo-Saxon kings ran a network of mints and moneyers under a tight design regime. regularly recalling old types and issuing new pennies. Regular recoinage did two jobs. It kept the currency uniform for assessments, and it generated a small margin for the crown, reinforcing the budget without fresh levies. That detail reveals a deeper point. Recurring payments require recurring standards. Weights, measures, and the faces on coins signal stability in an age without databases. If a reeve could trust a penny's silver content and a weights measure, he could trust his calendar to add up. In practice, that trust kept the whole routine from stalling on disputes. Christianization stitched these routines into a wider fabric. The Church did not insist on immediate inner conversion. It often accepted formal rites and outward observance. The important point was that baptism and observance brought northern peoples into closer touch with Europe's shared institutions and habits. That contact eased treaties, shared calendars, and even the ethics of collecting and paying. For decades, Vikings and their leaders used prime signing as a bridge. Being signed with the cross gave them access to Christian ports, courts, and employment, while keeping their way of life intact. As the sources note, leaders might accept baptism more than once as part of diplomatic bargains. What mattered here was not purity, but participation. Membership that allowed finance, law, and trade to run on common schedules. Prime signing's temporary credentials slowly gave way to full integration. Once rulers and towns shared saints' days, legal phrases, and oaths, it became easier to coordinate dues and taxes across borders. A collector could time deadlines by feast days. A merchant could expect similar toll rules from one shore to another. The connective tissue of Christendom smoothed the practical work of recurring obligation. Normandy shows the logic in political form. Around 911, a pact with Rollo exchanged land, loyalty, and defense of the Seine for predictable obligations. Instead of paying off a fleet that vanished with the tide, the Frankish king created a buffer that owed him service on a calendar. In practice, that deal folded recurring payment into a feudal compact that could be audited, not chased. Inside Normandy, the same subscription logic reappeared. Dues and services were apportioned to fiefs. Courts met on fixed days. Coin flowed to support castles and patrols. The Duke converted a raiding corridor into a managed revenue basin. That arrangement stabilized trade upriver and signaled to neighbors that order could be bought not once, but continuously. Predictability meant planning. With money arriving on time, rulers could decide campaigns a year ahead, not a month late. Garrisons received wages through winter, not just after harvest. Bridge and harbor repairs could be scheduled, not begged for. This helps explain why even peaceable reigns clung to the cadence of former tributes. There were costs. Heavy or repeated levies created resentment that resembled modern churn. In mid-11th century England, steep ship taxes to maintain large fleets sparked open anger in towns and shires. When people believed they paid for services they could not see or did not need, compliance slipped. Kings learned to calibrate, because predictable revenue dies when subscribers drift away. So rates were adjusted, exemptions granted, and amnesties announced to reset the relationship. The lesson was practical. Remission could retain. Public showpieces, like disbanding excess ships after a quiet season, signaled respect for the bargain. That detail mattered because the strength of recurring systems lies not only in enforcement, but in perceived fairness. By the late 11th century, the mechanism itself had outlived the Vikings, who had inspired it. Norman rulers in England levied geld as a routine land tax, even when no raider threatened the coast. The exchequer, an accounting chamber using a checkered cloth, counters, and tallies, emerged to track what sheriffs owed and paid. In practice, this was a subscription dashboard, centuries early. At those sessions, sheriffs rendered account by county, reconciling writs that authorized allowances and noting arrears to be carried forward. A rolling ledger replaced episodic memory. which is how a state learns to live across years rather than days. The pipe rolls when they begin. Capture that rhythm, lines, sums, notes, and continuations, like statements on returning service. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, commutation continued the earlier naval logic. Obligatory ship service shifted, in many districts, into money payments for royal use. Cash in hand allowed kings to hire where manpower lagged and to stock royal ships directly. The transformation from benches supplied to money, remitted marks, the same subscription move we have seen before. Church calendars quietly reinforced this administrative tempo. Deadlines clustered around major feasts, when people gathered and officials traveled. Tithes, ecclesiastical dues, habitually fell in cycles that ordinary people understood. That shared cadence made it easier to couple secular exactions to known times without constant renegotiation. The market tolls, discussed earlier, connected to these broader taxes in two ways. They trained people to expect payment for access and peace. They also supplied cash that could circulate to meet land-based obligations. Revenue farmers and portrees became extensions of the same collecting network that sheriffs used to hit annual targets. The subscription logic flowed back down the ladder as well. Lords parceled their geld shares across manors. Villages held meetings to divide quotas among households. That administrative trick, apportionment, made the tax feel normal because the community adjusted it internally. In practice, kings collected at the top, but the habit of recurring obligation took root in kitchens and fields. When rulers overreached, resistance revealed the limit case. Harsh arrears policies spurred flight and concealment, which cut future yields. Some kings answered by offering holidays from tax, or by tying reductions to visible milestones like wall repairs. The outcome reads like retention strategy: connect payment to value, or people quietly opt out. By the 12th century, the core pattern was set. Regular taxes, fees, and duties funded standing capacities that no single windfall could support. Mint standards and audit habits stabilized expectations. Cross-border norms, carried by shared religion and law, eased coordination. Emergency levies persisted, but they were no longer the skeleton of finance. The interesting turn is not moral, but mechanical. Vikings had once monetized fear by extracting one-time peace. States learned to monetize security by selling ongoing peace. That shift replaced the risk of raiding with the risk of mismanaging churn. In effect, the subscription model had moved from rivermouth to royal chamber. If this sounds modern, that is because the logic is durable. Recurring obligations create power by creating predictability, and predictability invites planning and scale. But the story carried into another arena too, where predictable payments underwrote not only ships and guards, but law itself. That is where we go next. Continua, let's pull the threads together. Across raids turned agreements, tolls turned custom, and levies turned budgets. The Viking world taught Europe a pattern: pay on a cycle, get an ongoing benefit. What mattered was not a one-off bargain, but a rhythm that both sides could plan around. That rhythm created predictability, and predictability created power. We can map the features one-to-one. The cadence was recurring, often tied to seasons, saints' days, or sailing windows, because calendars anchor memory and logistics. The benefit was ongoing: safety from raids, legal peace in markets, passage through straits, because protection and access decay if not maintained. Enforcement was built in, through patrols, oaths, and the credible threat of force, because recurring systems collapse without consequences. Upgrading and commutation showed up early. A ship levy could be commuted to silver, trading labor for money when a household had coin but lacked crew. A trading right could be upgraded by guild membership or by carrying a letter of conduct. These were levers to fit obligation to capacity, because flexibility keeps participation broad and payments timely. Churn risk existed too, in a pre-modern way. If collections were set too high, people fled, hid assets, or backed a rival lord. just as modern customers cancel when a price no longer feels fair. Smugglers and free riders were the medieval equivalent of unauthorized users on a network. The system had to balance coverage with tolerance, or the recurring flow thinned. The platform analogy holds with access itself. Ports, bridges, and market gates functioned as physical platforms. Pay, and you plug into legal peace, weights, and measures, and a safe exchange space. The value was not only the gate, but the shared rules inside it. That detail reveals why rulers invested in infrastructure once revenues stabilized. But there are limits to the analogy we should mark clearly. Coercion loomed larger then than customer choice does now, because failure to pay could mean corporal punishment, confiscation, or an armed visit. Yet even under coercion, these systems depended on perceived benefit. If a ruler could not keep seas safer, roads open, and courts impartial, compliance eroded and revolts brewed. That tension shows up in the sources. Skaldic poems praise kings who feed the wolves with enemies, but they also honor gift-giving and law-keeping, because credibility kept crews and taxpayers aligned. Archaeology gives the other half of the picture. Standardized weights, clipped coins, and repeated market layers point to routine, not chaos. Routine is what makes a subscription work. The value proposition then and now can be said in one line. Pay so the world around you stays usable. For a farmer, that meant fewer sudden raids, predictable court days, and safer ferry crossings. For a town merchant, it meant weights you could trust and debts you could enforce. For rulers it meant income steady enough to plan months and years ahead. Tiering and scope were not modern software, but the logic is familiar. Hides and ship districts spread obligation by capacity, because a coastal district could supply hulls while inland farms sent coin or grain. Guild tiers and local privileges layered access. Basic market rights for all. Enhanced protections or fee breaks for members. Organized obligation scaled the system without begging every villager new. The data of the age was not a spreadsheet. It was trust tech you could hold or swear. Standard weights acted like hardware tokens, preventing accidental or deliberate drift in value. Oaths bound officials and traders to fixed conduct, because spoken honor was enforceable in courts and assemblies. Hostages, however grim, operated as collateral, aligning incentives long enough for payments to clear. By the High Medieval period, ledgers began to formalize this trust. The exchequer's tallies and the pipe rolls turned promises into lines you could audit, because written continuity deters abuse and forgetting. That administrative habit reduced churn in a literal sense. Fewer arrears snowballed, fewer communities slipped out of the net, and more budgets closed as planned. When defaults did happen, penalties clicked in on both eras as timelines. In the Viking and post-Viking world, non-payment could trigger raids, seizure of goods, or exclusion from markets, which are all versions of cutting off service. In the modern world, the form softens, late fees, throttled features, or account suspension, but the logic is constant. Continuity relies on credible consequences. This helps explain why predictable revenue eventually underwrote law itself. Courts and writs are standing capacities. They cannot appear and vanish with each emergency. Once rulers could forecast income from heregeld like levies and regulated dues, they funded clerks, sheriffs, and assize circuits on a schedule. Law became a service with service levels, and people paid because they could see it arriving. To keep that trust, rate calibration mattered. Kings who pushed too hard discovered the limits in public assemblies. One preserved voice from a Norwegian thing puts it bluntly. Ask only what we can grant, and what is not unfeasible, or we part from you. That is an ethical baseline and a practical warning about churn under pressure. Consent did not erase coercion, but it set expectations. Assemblies, oaths, and charters created channels where subjects could bargain, because predictable revenue required predictable rules on both sides. In practice, that meant publishing custom, keeping audits, and permitting remission when harvests failed. Flexibility kept the cycle legitimate, and legitimacy kept the coins and ships coming. Seen this way, prime signing and cross-signing looked like onboarding rituals. They eased outsiders into an accepted status without demanding instant transformation, because access economics favors inclusion that pays. The church's calendar helped too, turning collections into liturgical habits that villages could remember. Habit is the quiet engine of recurring systems, and the Middle Ages built plenty of it. Now step back to the original puzzle. Why did repeated payments to Vikings become normal rather than exceptional? The answer lies in how recurring obligations reduce ambient risk. When ship districts knew their schedule and ports knew their toll books, raiding became less profitable than patrolling, and buying peace became cheaper than rebuilding. Predictability redirected energy, and with it, history's direction. There is also a data echo worth noting. Medieval trust tech, weights, oaths, hostages, reduced uncertainty through verifiable signals. Our era uses ledgers, tokens, and audit trails for the same reason. The medium changed, but the property is constant. Shared, checkable information lowers the cost of cooperating over time. That property is why subscriptions scale better than one-off transactions. When these systems failed, the symptoms rhymed across centuries. Defaults brought punitive sweeps, reputational damage, and exclusion, which are medieval versions of being deplatformed. Overreach by rulers produced resistance and substitution, which look like churn and shadow markets. Stable cycles demanded two ongoing repairs: recalibrate the ask and improve the service. Those are business rules, but they were political long before. Lessons for governance follow with some clarity. Recurring revenues fund standing capacity, whether that is a coast guard, a mint, or a court, because a steady stream can be pledged and managed. Episodic funding breeds volatility and short-termism, because it spikes with crises and collapses with calm. The Viking centuries forced Europe to practice the first model under pressure. Ethics sharpen the point. Paying for safety can entrench power, because the payer becomes dependent on the provider's continuing goodwill. That is why guardrails matter. Assemblies to voice limits, laws to cap rates, transparency to expose abuse, and representation to align incentives. The preserved thing speech is not only heritage, it is policy advice from a hard school. There is also a sober difference we should keep in view. Modern subscribers can usually opt out or switch providers, while medieval taxpayers often faced no safe exit. Yet the sustaining mechanism overlaps. Continued payment relies on continued value. When medieval kings lost campaigns or failed to patrol, arrears climb. When modern platforms decay, cancellations follow. The hinge is usefulness over time. Look again at the Norse footprint on later finance. Danegeld's logic, pay on schedule for peace, matured into heregeld, a tax with routing, officers, and audits. Market access dues became regular rents, farmed by professionals who guaranteed minimums to the crown. Naval levies organized by ship districts became template budgets for coastal defense. Each move shifted improvisation into institution. The Russian word variag, lingering as petlar, hints at the economy inside the raider image. Commerce was not a side note. It was the network through which recurring payments made sense. Traders needed corridors more than victories, and rulers who learned to sell corridors instead of loot earned more over time. That is a quiet but durable change in what power sells. From that shift comes our final synthesis. Recurring obligations, once a survival tactic, became a habit that structured states, markets, and expectations. They taught people to budget, to trust posted rates, and to demand delivery on a schedule. The subscription logic is older than software, older than banks, and through the Viking centuries, it learned to breathe inside government. If there is a takeaway for today, it is not nostalgia, it is calibration. Healthy recurring systems match the ask to the value, publish the terms, and accept review. They invest in the service before extracting more, because trust compounds slower than price. That was true at a harbor gate with a chest of weights, and it is true in a settings menu. And one caution endures. Normalizing payment for safety can tilt societies toward pay-to-live arrangements, unless checked by shared rules and real representation. The medieval assemblies that affirmed kings, but named limits, the audits that exposed excess, and the remissions that kept famine from becoming revolt. Those are not footnotes. They are the parts that made the rhythm sustainable. So when we auto-renew a subscription today, we echo an old bargain. We pay on time so the platform stays usable, and expect provider to keep the corridor open. The Vikings pushed Europe to formalize that cycle. Governments kept and wrote it into law.